2020 election, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter named Barton Gellman wrote a piece for The Atlantic about this seemingly far-fetched scheme. The article was called "The Election That Could Break America." The subhead there says, if the vote is close, Trump could easily throw the election into chaos and subvert the results. Who will stop him? Gellman described this scheme. Again, this was in advance of the election. This was September of last year. He wrote about this scheme by which Trump and his supporters would try to steal the election, or at least make it seem like the election had no clear result. Gellman reported in that piece, he broke the news that Republican officials in at least one swing state in Pennsylvania, they had been in touch already ahead of the election, and they'd been in touch with the Trump campaign about a plot to have the Republican-led state legislature in that state, and others, override the results from the voters. The state legislators would instead declare that the voters' intent couldn't be clearly discerned, there were big problems in the vote, and so instead the legislature would just declare that Trump had won. The legislature, the Republican-controlled legislature would decide to ignore the vote and just send Trump electors to the Electoral College, even if Biden had won the state. Bart Gellman, again, wrote that in September of last year. He wrote in advance of the election that that was the plan that the Trump side was working on, and it seemed crazy at the time. I mean, even as Trump was openly laying the groundwork for it before the voting was even started, he was calling the election a hoax before there was even voting. Even then, Gellman's reporting seemed like it was visiting from another planet, one that wouldn't necessarily sustain democratic life. But then, sure enough, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what Trump and company did. It's, in fact, what they're still trying to effectuate, right? In the state legislatures with these election reviews from Republican state legislatures in Arizona and in Wisconsin and other states. They're saying the election results should be decertified, which means that there shouldn't have been Biden electors from there. There should have been Trump electors, and Trump secretly won the election and he should be restored to power. I mean, that is what they tried after the election. That's still what Trump is trying. Bart Gellman was right about what Trump was going to do in 2020, as far-fetched as it seemed at the time. Well, now today, Barton Gellman has written his follow-up, also in The Atlantic. It's the new cover story that's out today, and it is called January 6th Was Practice. Here's how it starts. Technically, the next attempt to overthrow a national election may not qualify as a coup. It will rely on subversion more than violence, although each will have its place. If the plot succeeds, the ballots cast by American voters will not decide the presidency in 2024. Thousands of votes will be thrown away, or millions, to produce the required effect. The winner will be declared the loser. The loser will be certified president-elect. The prospect of this democratic collapse is not remote. People with the motive to make it happen are manufacturing the means. Given the opportunity, they will act. They are acting already. Who or what will safeguard our constitutional order is not apparent today. It's not even apparent who will try. Democrats, big and small d Democrats, are not behaving as if they believe the threat is real. Some of them, including President Biden, have taken passing rhetorical notice, but their attention wanders. They're making a grievous mistake. Richard Hassan, a professor of law and political science at UC Irvine, told me in late October, quote, "The democratic emergency is already here." Hassan prides himself on a judicious temperament. Only a year ago, he was cautioning me against hyperbole. Now he speaks matter-of-factly about the death of our body politic. Quote, "We face a serious risk that American democracy as we know it will come to an end in 2024, he said. But urgent action is not happening. For more than a year now, with tacit and explicit support from their party's national leaders, state Republican operatives have been building an apparatus of election theft. Elected officials in Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and other states have studied Trump's crusade to overturn the 2020 election. They've noted the points of failure from 2020 and have taken concrete steps to avoid failure next time. Some of them have rewritten statutes to seize partisan control of decisions about which ballots to count and which to discard, which results to certify and which to reject. They're driving out or stripping power from election officials who refused to go along with the plot last November, aiming to replace them with exponents of the big lie. They're fine-tuning a legal argument that purports to allow state legislators to override the choice of the voters. By way of foundation for all the rest, Trump and his party have convinced a dauntingly large number of Americans that the essential workings of democracy are corrupt. that made-up claims of fraud are true, that only cheating can thwart their victory at the polls, that tyranny has usurped their government, that violence is a legitimate response. Any Republican might benefit from these machinations, but let's not pretend there's any suspense. Unless biology intercedes, Trump will seek and win the Republican nomination for president in 2024. The party's in his thrall. No opponent can break it, and few will try. Neither will a setback outside politics like indictment or, say, a disastrous turn in business. Neither will those things prevent Trump from running. If anything, those could redouble his will to power. Quote, in nearly every battle space of the war to control the count of the next election, state houses, state election authorities, courthouses, Congress, the Republican Party apparatus, Trump's position has improved since a year ago. To understand the threat today, you have to see with clear eyes what happened, what's still happening after the 2020 election. The charlatans and cranks who filed lawsuits and led public spectacles on Trump's behalf were sideshows. They distracted from the main event, a systematic effort to nullify the election results and then reverse them. The strategic objective of nearly every move by the Trump team after the networks called the election for Biden on November 7th was to induce Republican legislatures in states Biden won to seize control of the results and appoint Trump electors instead. Every other objective in courtrooms, on state election panels, in the Justice Department, in the office of the Vice President, every other objective was instrumental to that end in the state legislatures. Although Trump won broad rhetorical support from state legislators for his fictitious claims of voter fraud, legislators were reluctant to take the radical, concrete step of nullifying the votes of their own citizens. Despite enormous pressure, none of the 6 contested states put forward an alternate slate of electors for Trump. Only later, as Congress prepared to count the electoral votes, did legislators in some of those states begin talking unofficially about decertifying the Biden electors. Still, though, the Trump team achieved something crucial and enduring by convincing tens of millions of angry supporters, including a catastrophic 68% of all Republicans in a November poll, that the election had been stolen from Trump. Nothing close to this loss of faith in democracy has happened here before. Even Confederates recognized Abraham Lincoln's election. They tried to secede because they knew they had lost. Delegitimating Biden's victory was a strategic win for Trump then and now, because the big lie became the driving passion of the voters who controlled the fate of Republican legislators, and Trump's fate was in the legislators' hands. Gellman then explains how the bizarro world theory that Republicans in state legislatures should just take over, nullify the actual votes in their states, instead just proclaim the winner that they prefer themselves. He goes through and explains how that crazy theory is now not just being propounded by crazy people like Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, it's being fine-tuned by real lawyers and is already circulating on places like Fox News as a Republican Party talking point for the election in 2024. Gellman explains point by point how Republicans who weren't on board with these kinds of efforts to throw out the real election results in 2020, those Republicans, everybody from, Brad Raffensperger and Brian Kemp in Georgia to lesser-known officials in Michigan and across the country, those Republicans who wouldn't go along with it for the 2020 election, they have been removed from office, they've been censured, they're facing Trump-backed primaries if they want to stay in office. He shows the polling data, which indicates that the Republican-based voters, they haven't cooled off or backed off from the literally revolutionary implications of what Trump tried to do to overturn the election. Over the past year, instead, Republican voters have become more militant on the subject and more likely to embrace violence as a potential solution. He says, quote, Donald Trump came closer than anyone thought he could to toppling a free election a year ago. He is preparing in plain view to do it again, and his position is growing stronger. Republican acolytes have identified the weak points in our electoral apparatus and are methodically exploiting them. They've set loose and now are driven by the animus of tens of millions of aggrieved Trump supporters who are prone to conspiracy thinking, who embrace violence, and who reject democratic defeat. Those supporters are armed and single-minded and will know what to do the next time Trump calls upon them to act. Democracy will be on trial in 2024. The midterms, marked by gerrymandering, will more than likely tighten the Republican Party's grip on the legislatures in swing states. The Supreme Court may be ready to give those legislatures near absolute control over the choice of presidential electors. And if Republicans take back the House and the Senate, as odds makers seem to believe they will, the Republican Party will be firmly in charge of counting the electoral votes. Against Biden or another Democratic nominee, Donald Trump may be capable of winning a fair election in 2024, but he does not intend to take that chance. Meaning he does not intend to take the chance of the election being conducted fairly. It sounds dystopian, I know. But the last time I read something that was simultaneously this serious, this well-reported, and this dystopian, it was Barton Gellman in September of 2020 predicting exactly what was going to happen with election 2020 and its aftermath up to and including January 6th. The last time I read something this serious and this worrying, it was Barton Gellman predicting something exactly. Well, this is what Bart Gellman is reporting today. He joins us next. A little later on this hour, we're going to be looking at today's move by the U.S. Justice Department to try to protect voting rights in Texas. DOJ today making the case that the new electoral maps that were drawn up by Texas Republicans, those illegally disadvantaged minorities in order to give extra disproportionate representation to white Texas Republicans. And that's the kind of action that the Justice Department has been taking on voting rights. It's actually the second time they've sued the state of Texas in the space of a month. But as Barton Gellman notes in his terrifying new cover story for The Atlantic magazine, while the Biden Justice Department has sometimes shown itself willing to go to court to protect voting rights from attacks by Republicans, they haven't been going to court to protect elections themselves, to protect democracy itself. And he uses as an example the state of Georgia, where, quote, the Justice Department has filed suit to overturn some provisions of the new Georgia law, but not to challenge the hostile takeover of election authorities. Instead, the DOJ's federal lawsuit takes issue with a long list of traditional voter suppression tactics. These provisions make it harder by design for Democrats to vote in Georgia. The provisions that Attorney General Garland did not challenge, though, are the ones that make it easier for Republicans to fix the outcome. Those provisions represent danger of a whole different magnitude. Meanwhile, Gellman writes, the Justice Department and the FBI are, quote, chasing down the foot soldiers of January 6th, but there's no public sign that they're building cases against the men and women who sent those foot soldiers. Absent consequences, they will certainly try again. An unpunished plot is practice for the next one. Joining us now is Barton Gellman, staff writer at The Atlantic, who's the author of today's cover story, January 6th Was Practice. Mr. Gellman, it is a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for terrifying me once again. Thank you for making time to be here tonight.
Thank you for having me on and for reading my stories. I don't want to publish anything else. I only want you to read my stories aloud.
Anything you publish, I will read. I'm telling you. And I will read them out loud for the most part. I can promise you. Well, let me ask you, in terms of the pieces, the elements of it that I chose to read and to present here on the air, let me ask you if I've got the important bits or if there's other pieces of this that you feel like you want a front page and you want to make sure people understand here.
You've honed in directly on the most important points, as usual, and you've been following this stuff as closely as anyone. The other big chunks of the story go into detail about what's happening in the states, but they also focus in on some individuals. I spent a lot of time with this firefighter in New York who's a Trump supporter and believes the election was stolen. And I wanted to understand why he believes that and whether his beliefs were capable of being altered by evidence. And I found that to be very interesting and very dispiriting, frankly. Because I couldn't budge him.
Bart, when you talk to Republican officials before the 2020 election, and they were willing to tell you in that very scary piece that they were in conversations with the Trump campaign, that there was a plan afoot to have state legislatures replace the vote with what they wanted to be the result of the election for their state. You wrote that up before the election in a way that was illuminating and shocking, but it was ultimately borne out. Do you feel like in your reporting right now, particularly of this idea about, moving to throw out thousands, if not millions of votes in the 2024 election, do you feel like you have similarly sort of uncovered something that might seem sort of far-fetched and unbelievable, but is actually a real plan?
I think it's very real. I'm personally, just as a citizen, very worried about it. I think you have people who are bound and determined not to allow Republicans to lose another national election, and not to allow Trump to lose another election. And they are giving themselves permission to do it. And this is something I don't go into in this piece, but you've seen it all. They are characterizing the Democrats as tyrants, as thieves of an election, who actually stole the presidency, as communists, as people who hate America, and they couldn't discuss it with any more extremity than they're doing. And when you do that, you give yourself permission to take all kinds of steps in opposition. I mean, if you have an existential threat to the United States of America, which is what Republicans are saying about Biden, then what remedy would not be allowed to you?
Is that why you believe, Bart, that the feeling among Trump supporters, especially the hard edges of Trump supporters, is hardening? Both the militancy around the election issue, which has gotten steadily worse over the course of the year, but also the openness to violence as a potential solution here, that's gotten worse over the course of this year, too. Is it simply a result of the type of rhetoric that you're describing, or is there some other dynamic at work?
I think there's a strong ongoing message that is amplified thousands of times by the whole ecosystem on the right, that is a propaganda ecosystem, and it is telling people that someone stole the election from them, that the Democrats are destroying the country, that more and more and more so-called evidence proves these things. And yeah, I think there's this very large mass of Trump supporters who believe both that Biden is an illegitimate president who stole the office, and that violence is justified. And frankly, I mean, if you were living in a country in which the election was literally stolen, and an imposter was holding office, why wouldn't violence be justified? I mean, they're making an argument that leads only to one place.
The cover story in The Atlantic right now is called "January 6th Was Practice. Donald Trump is better positioned to subvert an election now than he was in 2020. It is authored by Barton Gellman. Bart, staff writer at The Atlantic. Bart, thank you so much for your time tonight. Again, this is terrifying, but it's required reading. Really important stuff. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.